Now, Monday, just this Monday, the FDA announced that cattle blood will no longer, or chicken feces for that matter, will no longer be allowed in the feed of most animals, which is certainly a step forward, but unfortunately, too little, much too late. And that's because we continue to feed billions of pounds of slaughterhouse waste to pigs and chickens. So cattle remains to pigs and chickens, and then feed those same pigs and chickens straight back to the cows. Prion diseases are actually the only disease for which 2 separate Nobel Prizes were ever awarded. And the first Nobel went to a guy named Gajdusek, who was quoted on Dateline NBC as saying, quote, "It's got to be in the pigs as well as the chickens. It's got to be passing through the chickens, as well as the cattle." Paul Brown, medical director of the U.S. Public Health Service, believes that pigs and poultry could indeed be harboring this disease and passing it on to humans through meat. We're concerned that these animals, even though they're slaughtered too young to actually show this disease, could be what are termed silent carriers of the disease and pass it along to susceptible species like human beings. We are the only country in the world with mad cow disease that continues to allow the feeding of slaughterhouse waste in this kind of indirect cannibalism circuit here in the U.S. Europe, for example, bans the feeding of all slaughterhouse waste to livestock. The U.S. should do the same. The American Feed Industry Association, however, disagrees. They call such a ban a radical proposition. The American Meat Institute also disagrees, stating, quote, "No good is accomplished by prejudicing segments of society against the meat industry," unquote. We need to close up the loopholes, and we need strict enforcement. 4 years after the so-called ban went into effect, up to a quarter of the plants were found in violation of these feed regulations, these feeble regulations in the first place. And the law just says you have to label your feed. So you have to label anything containing cattle remains, "Do not feed to cows or other ruminants." Right? You can still sell this stuff. You can still buy this stuff. Any farmer can walk into any feed store and still buy it. No one asks them, "Wait a second, are you just feeding this to pigs, pets, and poultry, or are you feeding this to cows too?" Right? As hard as it has been to enforce these regulations among feed plants and rendering mills, it's practically impossible to enforce it among the country's million livestock producers. There's zero policing on the ranch itself, so it shouldn't even be available for sale. We also need to make Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, the human disease, a reportable illness here in the U.S. Neuropathologists are paranoid. No one wants to do autopsies on human atypical dementia cases because they're afraid of catching this disease, right? You got to come in like a spacesuit, and it's difficult to sterilize your instruments. When a few intrepid researchers have, however, actually gone back and looked at the brains of presumed Alzheimer's deaths, meaning it said Alzheimer's on the death certificate, anywhere between 3 and 13% of those Alzheimer's cases were actually CJD. Between 3 and 13% of Alzheimer's cases are actually Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. 4 million Americans are afflicted with Alzheimer's disease. The Centers for Disease Control says that Alzheimer's is the 8th leading cause of death in the United States. How many people in this audience personally know someone who died with Alzheimer's disease? Well, based on the best science we have, 3 to 13% of you are wrong. You actually knew someone that died of Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. And new research suggests that some of these so-called sporadic 1 in a million CJD cases may actually be caused by mad cow disease, or maybe infected lamb, or even infected pork. So hundreds or even thousands of Americans could already be dying from mad cow disease because of mad cow disease every year in this country. But how could that be, though, right? There's only been 1 case of mad cow disease found in the U.S. There's only been 1 case found in the United States. How many one finds is a function of how hard one looks for the disease. Mad cow disease doesn't come in isolated cases, right? Because cows don't get like their little individual TV dinners, right? There was infected feed, and now there are infected cows. How many, we will never know until we actually test more for the disease. Europe has millions fewer cattle than we do, yet they're testing 1 million cows every month. France, which has just but a fraction of our cattle population, tests more every week than we've tested in our entire 14-year testing history. Germany tests about 60,000 a week, more than we've tested in a decade. And Germany also once confidently declared itself BSE-free until they actually started testing for it intently and found 30 cases within the first 2 months. Right? You cannot find what you're not looking hard enough for. Dr. Stanley Prusiner, the world's expert on these diseases, he won the 1997 Nobel Prize in Medicine for his discovery of prions, describes the level of testing done by the USDA as appalling. In fact, there's circumstantial evidence that we've had mad cows in the U.S. since 1960, decades ago. Prusiner is calling for universal testing, testing every cow slaughtered for human consumption like they do over in Japan. Now, if we did do more testing, how many mad cows might we find? Well, we won't know, obviously, until we do it, but based on the testing so far, the chair of the Department of Biostatistics down at the University of Texas made an estimate. Estimates that we may have thousands of cows infected with mad cow disease slaughtered every year. That means Americans may be eating millions, literally millions, of servings of infected beef every year. Now, to anyone familiar with our agricultural practices, the discovery of mad cow disease in North America came as no surprise. But given the appallingly inadequate surveillance we've been doing, the fact that we actually found a case was quite a shock. And actually, we seem to pick it up almost as a fluke, which I'd be happy to talk about as well. Every year, an estimated 195,000 to 1.8 million cattle collapse in the U.S. for largely unknown reasons and are too sick or injured to rise. Every year, we have hundreds of thousands of these so-called downer cattle in the U.S. And even though these downed animals were not even fit enough to stand, an investigation of USDA slaughter records showed that most of them were still ruled fit enough for human consumption. And these animals can be the sickest of the sick. Gangrene, malignant, cancerous growths. I mean, these dragged, hauled alive by bulldozer to the slaughterhouse. And the majority went straight onto the American dinner plate. The World Health Organization recommends that every single downer animal, every single downer cow, be tested for mad cow disease. In the United States, instead, we put ketchup on them. Why has only one case of mad cow disease been discovered in the U.S.? Perhaps it's because Americans have been eating all of the evidence. For years, meat from downer cattle has been excluded by law from the federal school lunch program. Right? So the government recognized that this meat was too risky to feed to America's school children at school, but not too risky to feed to them once they got home from school, and not too risky for adults, for that matter. Finally, though, cows too sick to even walk have been excluded from the entire human food supply. Yet there are still hundreds of thousands of downer pigs, for example, and other animals dragged into the slaughterhouse and killed for human consumption. Congressman Gary Ackerman is introducing a bill to ban all downer animals from the human food supply, which I encourage everyone to pressure your elected officials to support.
The first case of mad cow disease in the United States in 6 years, found in a California dairy cow. Now, already some supermarkets in Asia, specifically those in South Korea, have stopped selling American beef. ABC's Jim Avila has the very latest for us this morning. Good morning to you, Jim.
Good morning, Josh. The discovery was totally random, pure luck. The dairy cow was dead on arrival and exhibited no outward signs of mad cow. This is the plant where the latest mad cow was discovered in Hanford, California. It's only the fourth case in U.S. history, and no American has ever contracted the disease on native soil. 175 people died horrible deaths in the 1990s English outbreak.
The safeguards we have in the U.S. are very effective. Our food is safe.
The USDA inspectors took a brain sample of the infected dairy cow at the rendering plant that turns fat into cooking oil and biofuel. One of only 40,000 cows tested for mad cow disease each year. Less than 1% of the tens of millions of cattle slaughtered.
The government needs to be taking stronger action in both surveillance and in terms of the feeding practices.
The U.S. has banned feeding cattle beef remnants, which are the only way to spread the disease. But the FDA is now investigating if someone broke the feed ban. Because mad cow is not infectious through the air, making this a literal case of mystery meat. The meat industry moved quickly to say American beef is safe, but critics want more tests before they sound the all clear. Josh?
Jim Avila, thank you for that this morning.
John Stauber, Center for Media and Democracy, and Sheldon Rampton and I wrote Mad Cow USA a decade ago, which predicted the emergence of the disease in the U.S. because these feeding practices were happening and we were being lied to about them.
You're familiar with that company that's suing for the right to test their own beef?
Creekstone.
Creekstone.
Yeah.
I wonder how far away they are.
They've only just begun. That'll went through the courts for years probably. And in the meantime, they've lost access to the Japanese market for their beef. The Japanese said, sure, you can continue to sell us your beef, but you have to test it like we do. And any cow you find with mad cow, you have to keep out. They said, okay, we'll do it. They went about doing it. The U.S. Department of Agriculture stepped in and said, we will not allow it. They said, why not? They said, because there's no scientific basis for testing this meat. And they cited a law from the 19-teens, that had nothing to do with testing for mad cow disease. So, yeah, here's a great example. The U.S. Department of Agriculture now admits we've had mad cow disease in this country for 10 years. We know mad cow disease can move into the human population and kill people. In Japan, they test 100% of their cattle. In Europe, they test tens of millions of cattle. That way they find out if they're successfully keeping the infected beef out of the food supply. In the U.S., we test fewer than 0.5%. All that testing is secret, and only the government does it. So do you trust the government? Of course not. You can't verify this. In the United States, it's illegal to feed cattle blood to calves. You can go into feed stores all around rural America and buy a calf supplement for dairy calves. So you take them off their mother's milk and you put them on this stuff, and then you look at what's it from, and it's from, legally, from cattle blood and cattle fat with cattle protein in it, all of which can transmit mad cow disease. It's not a matter of it's super expensive to test this. It's a matter of the U.S. beef industry is so politically powerful. They make billions of dollars taking slaughterhouse waste and rather than disposing of it properly, feeding it back to livestock for fat and protein supplements. That's what amplifies and spreads mad cow disease. Half of every animal is unfit for human consumption. So, and we know from mad cow disease that if you feed that back to cows, you're going to amplify and spreading it. We've been doing that for decades in this country, even though we're all told it's not done, it's legal. And we've got mad cow disease. So yeah, it's just a total Orwellian situation.
Well, and a lot of farmers and a lot of people say it's illegal to feed rendered feed back to cows, but we're operating, and my understanding is we're operating on an honor system.
Exactly. Here's the law. The law says that if you're a feed company, the feed you bag that is from cattle is supposed to be labeled that it contains cattle, meat, and bone meal, right? Well, that's just a labeling law. Once those bags are bought, they can be fed to any animal, and the inspection of that labeling law is totally inadequate. The countries that have dealt successfully with mad cow disease have said, we are not going to allow any slaughterhouse waste to be fed back to any livestock, period. That's what you have to do, because then the stuff isn't going to the farm. I was in a feed mill with the Japanese TV crew a year and a half ago in a little rural town in Wisconsin, and they were showing us their meat and their bone meal that they're mixing into cattle feed. It was just in a huge, big bin, and they said, but don't worry, it comes from pigs. Yeah, it comes from pigs that are fed cattle, meat, and bone meal, and there's no way of even knowing that it comes from pigs because it all looks the same. There's two ways it's being hidden. One is that it takes 20, 30, 40 years for a human to develop mad cow disease. We know from Britain's experience that the transmission from the cattle into people is fairly inefficient. Only about 200 people are confirmed worldwide to have died of human mad cow disease. There are thought to be thousands of people who are incubating it, but they won't die for years because there's this long invisible latency period. But also now we know that in Britain there are 2 people who are dead of mad cow disease, not from eating the cows, but from getting blood products from humans who ate the cows. Mad cow disease is contaminating the human blood supply. There's no test that can find mad cow disease in blood. It's a very invisible disease. We don't know how many people are going to eventually contract it from cattle. And the big question now is, once it's in people, it spreads much more effectively from people to people. And we know it spreads through the blood supply. It could spread through infected surgical instruments. If somebody is operated on, for instance, their brain, and those instruments are sterilized, it's impossible to sterilize those instruments to kill prion diseases. So basically, what we're dealing with is a problem that, for many reasons, is unfortunately easy to sweep under the rug, but eventually it crops up down the road. We don't know how big a price we're going to pay for our failure to put in place the strict feeding ban and testing that the Europeans have put in place.
Well, what about the misdiagnosis that people say it's being diagnosed as Alzheimer's? Or this new one, rapid onset Alzheimer's. Does that make you wonder?
Well, there's 4 or 5 million people in this country right now who have this dementia disease called Alzheimer's. And within that big population, you can mask other dementias. And people are not routinely autopsied with dementia diseases. In fact, there's a bias against doing autopsies on people with dementia because it might be human mad cow, or it might be another form, sporadic Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, another form of human prion diseases. And if it is, all those autopsy instruments and any medical instruments used on that patient have to be permanently disposed of because you can't disinfect them. So we've got this situation here where, we have a huge population of people with dementia, and because we're not routinely autopsying and we're not aggressively looking for Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease cases, we don't know how many there are in the U.S. That doesn't mean that we have hundreds of thousands of cases, but it probably means that we're missing hundreds or maybe even thousands of cases. They could be sporadic, they could be familial rapid onset, they could be human mad cow disease. We're not looking for this. We're not dealing with the disease. Other countries deal with it. They've learned from their mistakes. All the EU countries, Japan, we don't learn from their mistakes. We just try to hide it and tell the public we're doing the right things when we're not. Not as far as we know, but we do have chronic wasting disease, of course, in Wisconsin, which is a same type of disease, an infectious prion disease. One thing that's interesting about chronic wasting disease is it's spread very readily, deer to deer, through saliva. So we do have an example of this type of disease that's rather easily spread through saliva. We certainly haven't seen that in the human variations, thank goodness. But what the prion scientists will tell you is this is why you should be super cautious in dealing with prion diseases, because they're unlike anything else. New strains are created, and we don't know what those strains will be capable of doing. And this strain we call chronic wasting disease, we now know from some very good research that was done in Colorado, is actually highly infectious through saliva, deer to deer. Well, I'm not saying it's spreading people to people in saliva, but this is like, if you want to develop a nightmare scenario of what are worst case scenarios, a human prion disease that spreads that way would be one of them. What I tell people is eat organic, especially in Wisconsin. You can get organic.
So I tell them at least stay away from
single cuts, stay away from the spine. John Stauber, Center for Media and Democracy, and Sheldon Rampton and I wrote Mad Cow USA a decade ago, which predicted the emergence of the disease in the U.S. because these feeding practices were happening and we were being lied to about them.
I had no idea when we started the magnitude of what we were getting into.
No matter how bad your worst day is, it is nothing compared to what the average farm animal is undergoing every day for weeks, for months, or even years.
3 years in the making, 150 hours of footage.
I don't know what other industry can compare to the agribusiness, biotech, pesticide conglomerates, maybe military contractors.
Countless interviews throughout the world with activists, scientists, victims, ranchers, farmers, doctors and consumers. Opinions on every side of the issues. Some people believe the worst is over. Some believe the worst is yet to come.
You know, we were talking this morning after church about terrorism. We all lived in such a safe cocoon, it couldn't happen to us, terrorism. And I think a lot of the stockmen feel mad cow disease couldn't happen to us.
It's all crucial to finding a balance that has the potential to change the way that people think and feel.
We're trying to encourage people to understand that there are new constituents here. There are other beings who should be part of the moral community and who have an equal stake, an equal say in the moral community, who have an equal share in it, and they happen not to be human beings.
It is without a doubt the most important thing I have ever been involved in my life.
This is a book all our scrapbooking friends made. Just love dragonflies. It's got the dragonfly.
For Kip Lavin, the warm memories of his 17 years with wife Michelle well up just as quickly as the tears of loss.
She always had a smile. Her laugh was great. She was great. Really miss her.
In March of 2011, 42-year-old Michelle experienced a sudden onset of stroke-like symptoms, difficulty speaking, confusion, and odd movements. All tests came back negative, and she was sent home. But Michelle was still struggling.
You know, everything was not working. She'd put her shirts on backward.
Within a few days, Michelle was back in the hospital to stay. Stroke and meningitis were ruled out. Kip says primary care doctors and specialists were stumped. And then, without the chance to ever say goodbye, his wife was gone.
40 days, I think, from the beginning to the end, it was done.
The diagnosis, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, CJD. There is no treatment, and it is always fatal.
We call rapidly dementing illness. That's something that affects cognitive skills, memory, thinking, behavior, and it comes on rapidly.
Mayo Clinic neurologist Dr. Alan Axemet says an abnormal infectious protein called a prion is believed to be the cause of CJD, actually creating holes in and around neurons in the brain.
It co-opts the normal protein, and then it becomes a self-replicating or self-amplifying process, which essentially kills neurons and gets transmitted to other neurons in the vicinity.
Dr. Axemet says 90% of cases are sporadic, striking spontaneously without a known cause. The other 10% are familial, which was Michelle's case. Kip says that means their sons Cody and Devin have a 50-50 chance of developing CJD, a possibility he finds very hard to bear.
The normal person, if you knew you had it, you couldn't get married, you couldn't have kids, you know.
Since CJD affects just 1 in a million people, research is slow to progress, yet that is Kip's only hope of erasing the long shadow cast by a dreaded disease. For Mayo Clinic News Network, I'm Dennis Doda.
Zombies! You'd think we'd be done with them by now, but there are still zombie books and zombie comic books and zombie movies and zombie TV shows and zombie parades. Can we move on to like harpies or manticores or something? We can't seem to let zombies go. And there are a bunch of theories as to why. What makes most sense to me is that disease remains the final serious predator of mankind. And dead people are a pretty serious reminder and traditionally a serious cause of disease. So yeah, dead people are scary, and they're scarier when they start moving around. Of course, there's also the whole brain-eating thing, which leads me to prions. Not prions, which are spelled the same but pronounced differently and are birds, and also not prions, which are pronounced the same but spelled differently and are theoretical point particles that quarks may be composed of, but prions, evil little misfolded proteins that destroy brains and get passed from animal to animal, mostly through the consumption of nervous tissue, by which I mean brain-eating. Proteins have a linear sequence determined by our DNA, but that sequence doesn't actually determine how the protein works. Getting proteins to work relies on them taking the correct three-dimensional shape. How this happens is super complicated, but in prions, they are the wrong shape, and it's a bad shape. All prion diseases are caused by the misfolding of the same protein called PRP, which after years of study we have determined does something. It seems to affect the formation of memories, and it's also apparently important to sleep, since a mutation of the protein in mice was found to cause fatal insomnia. Yes, they die of not sleeping. But whatever this protein does when it's folded correctly, we know it's important because it's encoded by what we call a highly conserved sequence. A sequence in our DNA that's very similar across a broad swath of life, in this case mammals. So all mammals have very similar forms of this healthy PRP protein. When we see highly conserved sequences, we know that even slight mutations to those areas are deadly. This is also why prion diseases are so easily transferred from mammal to mammal, because the proteins are very similar. But the real problem here isn't that the incorrectly folded proteins are dangerous, but that they're also really good at convincing healthy proteins to change shape to the dangerous form. As prions convert more and more healthy proteins into prions like themselves, they clump together and accumulate in brain tissue. These clumps of prions kill the brain cells, causing holes in the brain which lead to the brain tissue getting like literally spongy, which is why the technical term for mad cow disease is bovine spongiform encephalopathy, which literally translated means cow spongy brain brain disease. I like how sometimes when you translate a Latin name to an English one, it makes scientists sound like 4-year-olds. Spongy brain tissue diseases, it turns out, make you super weird and then eventually dead. Symptoms of these diseases include unsteady gait, deterioration of speech, increased jerkiness of movement, and as the disease progresses, bouts of uncontrollable laughter, urinary and fecal incontinence, you know, the normal zombie stuff. There are, by the way, no cures for prion diseases. You zombify and then you die. So you might be wondering, we humans aren't super accustomed to eating brains or spinal cords or anything, so who even gets a prion disease in the first place? Well, sometimes, very rarely, the proteins can misfold in the brain all by themselves, and sometimes people get stuff like Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease because they've gotten a blood transfusion with contaminated blood or had surgery where the surgical implements weren't properly sterilized. But usually people get CJD from eating meat from infected animals, which is why they killed all those cows in the UK back in the day, and why we don't, feed cow brains to cows anymore. Back to brain eating though. We must examine the bizarre case of Kuru, a prion disease found in the Foray people of Papua New Guinea. Until the 1950s, the Forays had a custom of consuming their dead at mortuary feasts. You know, like you do. The men of the tribe customarily ate the muscles of their deceased friend, while women and children ate the brains. Between 1920 and the 1960s, an epidemic of Kuru swept through the Foray people, killing upwards of 200 people a year. Women and children, of course, being the most vulnerable because they ate the most brains. But here's something fascinating. The scientists studying the Foray's Kuru epidemic found that some of the women who had participated in the mortuary feast had a genetic mutation that protected them from experiencing the symptoms of Kuru. They had a resistance to the disease. Researchers studying this genetic resistance believe that this could mean that human ancestors could have been cannibalizing each other as long as 500,000 years ago, which is probably the reason why prion diseases aren't more common. So, we do have cannibalism to thank for at least that one thing. Other good news, when someone dies of a prion disease, in 100% of cases, so far, they have remained dead. Thanks for watching this SciShow Dose. If you have any comments or questions or ideas, we're on Facebook and Twitter, and of course down in the comments below. And if you want to keep getting smarter with us, you can go to youtube.com/SciShow and subscribe.
Of my age, mad cow disease seems like a distant nightmare, something that haunted us on the news as we grew up. Tonight's programme has made me think again and sadly given the disease a painful new relevance. It's about a young guy, like me, starting out on a career in the media when he was struck down by the human form of the disease. And it's a story about a mother's relentless search for answers. She tries to find out who killed her son.
Your tongue out, go on. Go on, pull a face.
My name's Christine Lord. My 24-year-old son is upstairs in my bedroom dying of the human form of mad cow's disease. I'm extremely angry that this tragedy has happened to my fit, young, handsome son, and I want some answers. And I want to find out who was responsible for killing my son.
Go on, pull a face, Andy. Put your tongue out. Go on.
This is Christine's story. Her son Andrew has just been diagnosed with variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, or VCJD, even though he hasn't eaten beef for years.
Andy Black. Andy Black.
Andrew has worked on national radio since he was 16.
It's February 2005, and I've already broken my New Year's resolution that I'd stop giving...
He was still working as a producer just 6 months ago.
I'll tell you what, it's as crazy as a bag of old rag.
Now he can hardly talk.
This is to my number one son, Andrew. Thank you for being you and for coming into my life. You will have a big part of my heart forever.
Christine didn't want us to film Andrew because she thought it might upset him, so we gave her a camera to film important events herself, like his 24th birthday. She also used the camera to record her own thoughts.
It's his birthday today, and last night we went out with his friends. We went to the fun fair, and I stood with Andrew while they got on the waltzers and they went on the roller coasters and all the other things that young people do. I wondered what was actually going through Andrew's head because, you know, all his friends were full of beans, jumping around, in and out, dancing around, and he was laughing with them. But there was a sense of bewilderment on his face a lot of the time, and we brought him home. And in the car, he started trembling. Immediately, I have a picture of the footage of the mad cows that was on TV throughout the 80s. And my son had its really wide eyes and his teeth were chattering. I knew it wasn't the cold.
To help find out how the disease is transmitted, scientists have asked Christine to fill in a questionnaire about the products Andrew might have used.
Contact lens fluids, HRT, homeopathic medicines, school dinners, baby formula, Farley's Rust, everything that you could possibly think is in here. I do lie awake at night and think, you know, perhaps if he hadn't had those immunisations, perhaps if he hadn't had school dinners, that he wouldn't be dying. I want some answers, and I'd like to talk to people that were involved in this. And I'd like to talk to people that allowed this to happen.
Christine's a freelance journalist, so she's used to researching stories. Now she wants to find some answers about what's happened to her son. She's come to Pitsam Farm near Midhurst, where the first case of mad cow disease was spotted in 1984. It's just 30 miles from her home in Southsea.
Hello, David.
Good morning,
I'm Christine.
Hi, Christine.
So this was the dairy where you found your first case?
Through the back there's a roofed shed, and that's a straw yard.
Yeah.
So these cattle were straw yard housed.
Yeah.
And when we were doing examination...
Vet David B was called out to treat that first cow. 7 other cows later died after displaying similar symptoms.
We did have a range of clinical signs. We had cows that were aggressive, cows that had lost weight, cows that had become incoordinate, so they couldn't walk normally. They would pick up a back leg awkwardly. Cows with head tremor. And we weren't seeing those anywhere else. So we actually called it Pitsam Farm syndrome. It was something that we were sure and convinced was specific to this place. We never dreamt it was going to be the terrible disease it's been in cattle, and even more so with people tragically like your son.
The symptoms that you described about lack of coordination, trembling, loss of weight, that's exactly what I've been experiencing with my son for 6 months.
This trip is the first time Christine has been more than a few miles from Andrew since he was diagnosed.
It's a journey I've had to make on his behalf, because he can't do it himself. And I have to be his voice in the wilderness, because it feels like we've been forgotten, and I think the broader public at large has forgotten about it, and everybody in the UK over 10 has been exposed to this.
I need to give you a hug.
Did you brush your teeth when you had a bath? Did you brush your teeth? You can't remember?
Andrew is gradually losing control of his body.
I'm very good. Do you want me to do it, Mum? Do you want Emma to do it? What's wrong? What's wrong?
But Christine is still filming, because she wants the public to know what it's like. She gets the camera out whenever she has a moment to herself.
His arms are all bending and going in all peculiar shapes.
She's been advised to put Andrew in hospital.
Too many questions, no answers. Got my diary here.
But she's determined to care for him at home.
It's like a dam is about to burst, and it may do it at the wrong time.
Because occasionally there are still glimpses of her son.
For about half an hour, it felt like I had most of my son back, because he talked quite coherently and quite sensitively. In fact, he said to me, "Mum, you're working too hard, this is too much." What a wonderful man my son is.
The cows from Pitson Farm had a brain disease, spongiform encephalopathy. It's common in sheep and is known as scrapie, but it had never been seen in cows before. Government scientists realised it might be dangerous. But a memo, written in 1986, suggested playing it low-key. This is the first time that Christine has read it.
If the disease turned out to be bovine scrapie, it would have severe repercussions to the export trade and possibly also for humans. It is for these reasons I have classified this document confidential.
For the next 18 months, farmers were allowed to sell infected beef to the public.
The disease will have severe repercussions to the export trade and possibly also for humans. I think the telling word is export trade. It's profit over people again.
The public wasn't told about bovine spongiform encephalopathy, or BSE, until almost a year after the memo was written.
Also tonight, the mystery disease that is killing cows in 14 counties.
Government experts soon realised that BSE had been caused by feeding animal protein to cattle. At the time, they believed it had come from scrapie in sheep, and as scrapie had never been a danger to humans, they concluded that BSE would not be dangerous either.
Everyone, children, adults, patients in hospital, can be quite confident that it's safe to eat beef.
I am totally, completely sure that there is no risk to man from eating beef, and that meat is quite safe to be eaten by man either in this country or any other country of the world.
In 1990, BSE jumped species when a cat was infected by pet food. Some scientists were now worried, but the government still insisted beef was safe. Agriculture Minister John Gummer was so convinced, he used his daughter Cordelia to reassure the public.
And it's like beef burger should be, without onions. Can I have a... And in a moment I shall put some ketchup on it. But Cordelia doesn't like ketchup very much, actually.
The government said it was acting on the best scientific advice, but one of the scientists on its advisory committee was also a paid consultant to the beef industry. When the government wanted some reassurances about the safety of beef, the industry actually drafted some suggested answers and sent them to its scientist on the committee.
We agree that we need succinct answers to the questions, and my colleagues in our PR company have drafted the sort of answers they would like to see.
Again, it's the first time that Christine has read this, and it's an emotional discovery.
When I'm reading this as a journalist, I'm also reading this as a parent of Andrew. The journalist in me is absolutely fired up. I need to find out more about this. But also the mum in me needs to find more about this. But also the mum in me is so upset because my son is dying because of this.
Andrew's condition is getting worse.
Can you hear me? A bit thirsty.
He's no longer aware of his surroundings, so Christine has agreed to let us film him.
Right, let's try and have a drink for Mummy. I'm so exhausted, I am beyond tears. Bit of swallow. And again. Huge sighs and massive gasps for air go through his body every couple of hours. He has a sheen of sweat over his face and oil constantly that we have to keep wiping away. And I'm not sure how much longer this will go on. This could go on for a long time. Now, Mummy's going to put some drops under your tongue, okay? And that'll stop you having all that spit there, okay? At times I feel like, you know when you get a chip in the windscreen of your car?
and if you just touch it accidentally, the whole thing shatters. That's how I feel. That's how fragile I am. You're in a deep sleep, aren't you? Aren't you? Hmm? Did you hear that? You like that, don't you? You like Mummy stroking you? Don't you? Yeah. And we talk about all the things that you've done, all the happy times that we've had, the holidays, and how much you make me laugh and smile. Yeah? And what a handsome, talented young man you are. And we talk about things like that.
Christine's search for answers has brought her to London to see the man who is leading the search for a cure.
We've been able to stop the disease in its tracks and reverse it in laboratory mice by a particular procedure which hits the normal prime protein in the brain. It's
too late for Andrew, but Professor John Collins thinks a treatment for people may be just a few years away.
This research is going very well. We're making a lot of progress, but it's still going to be some years before we'll have a drug that achieves that. But we think it is achievable.
The number of VCJD cases has been falling.
This laboratory is our containment level 3 laboratory. It's a special laboratory where human and bovine prions, BSE prions...
But there's still a desperate need for a cure, as researchers fear there could be a second wave of cases.
You can see it's one of the largest facilities of its type in Europe. This may be the first wave in people who are unusually genetically susceptible. And that others in the population who are less susceptible and have longer incubation periods may still be infected, but they won't show signs of the disease for many years.
Could there be thousands out there incubating the disease then?
There could certainly be thousands. We have to consider that maybe 1 in 1,000 of the population might be silently carrying the infection. That's entirely possible.
This is also the hospital where Andrew was first diagnosed.
The last time I was here, he was upstairs having a tonsil biopsy, and I came down here to the chapel and looked at the request for prayer. And there's a lot of sick people in this hospital. A lot of people still have hope. And I read the ones before and it said, you know, God bless Dad, let him get better from his stroke, let my little baby become well again. And I knew that there was just absolutely no hope for my son. So actually I wrote a prayer, please let my Andrew be at peace. And as his mother, I prayed that he actually didn't come round from the anaesthetic, because I knew what was ahead of him and I didn't want him to go through that. So while everybody else was down here with prayers of hope, prayers of like, Dad get better, Mum get better, I was actually praying for my son to die.
By the mid-90s, several scientists were concerned about the risks to human health, but it wasn't easy to speak out.
Were scientists and experts leaned on?
In the early 90s and mid-90s, yeah, I certainly was.
Like what?
Well, I had phone calls from government departments, you know, in, you know, somewhat intimidating terms. I wouldn't describe them as threats, but they'd left you in no doubt that you weren't making yourself very popular by saying these things.
The government thought beef was safe because it had banned the sale of the infectious parts of the cow. The brains, offal and spinal cords were supposed to be removed, but some ended up in a product called MRM, mechanically recovered meat, which was used in hospitals and schools. So Andrew could have caught VCJD from school dinners.
You know, very large numbers of people are at school and they're there for years. So the actual exposure to school dinners and potential exposure to MRM was potentially large. I'm only speculating here, but that would sort of make sense.
As Andrew's mother, I feel very angry that I didn't have an informed choice. If actually I'd seen the memos that I've seen now in 1980, which were in 1985, go right back to 1985, I would have chosen for him not to have school meals. And he may very well be here now.
Christine believes the answers might lie back at his old schools. She's been talking to former dinner ladies who have told her that before it was decided to remove the brain and spinal cord, the government encouraged them to use offal because it was so cheap.
They minced it all up and disguised it and hid it in the pies, the sausages, the burgers, so that children would eat it. And of course that was the most highly infectious part of the animal during the BSE crisis.
Later in the 80s, schools stopped using offal, but many switched to MRM, the mechanically recovered meat that may still have contained infectious material.
I keep seeing my son, 5, 6, 7, 8, right up until he was about 11, 12. But especially little, holding his dinner money and going into school and saying, "Mum, I got my dinner money." And I gave him the money that killed him. And that's a terrible thing that I'm having to carry. This is breaking my heart. And I didn't think it could break anymore, to be honest. My house drips sadness now. It's just everywhere. As much as I try to be optimistic and full of fun, which is basically my personality, and I try to be very buoyant around Andrew. In Andrew's bedroom there's a row of his clothes now, and I know that he will never wear outdoor clothes again. He's in pyjamas now all the time now. He will never walk outside this house again. The next time he goes outside this house will be in his coffin.
Andrew's now been put on a morphine pump.
All his medication now goes through here and then through the muscle, and also he's on fluids as well to keep him hydrated. So this driver is now in a really pretty bag that I bought several summers ago, and it's like, who would have thought, you know, when I bought that bag, that this was what it would be used for. And the reason why it's used for that is so it's a bit unobtrusive really for my daughter and for people coming into the room. Outside there, the world is moving on and moving forward, and to a certain extent it feels like time in a way is suspended here a bit, but at the same time it's sort of running through my fingers like quicksand really. I've stayed with Andrew constantly since the weekend. It's Thursday today, and I think I probably had about 5 hours sleep in those days. It was just a case of laying there in the silence with him really, and holding his hand and telling him that it's okay to let go. It's 8:20, and as you can hear, the alarm's gone off again. It's gone off every 35 minutes since midnight. The noise that he was making, like a car backfiring, but worse, 1,000 times worse than that. Like that. Andrew's breathing now is every 30 seconds, and then he stops, and then he starts again. I've been told eventually he won't start again, so I'm laying next to him wondering, is this the last breath my son will ever take? Sunday, 16th of December. Sorry, thank you so much. Saturday the 16th of December at 9:25, Andrew died. 24 years of age.
With permission, Madam Speaker, I would like to make a statement about the latest advice which the government has received from the Spongiform Encephalopathy Advisory Committee.
In 1996, the government announced that BSE had jumped to humans.
The unit has identified a previously unrecognised and consistent disease pattern.
It was 12 years after the first case at Pitson Farm. 10 years after scientists first discovered the possible risks in that confidential memo. And 6 years after Agriculture Minister John Gummer assured the public that beef was safe to eat. Lord Phillips' inquiry into BSE concluded that the government's campaign of reassurance was a mistake. He suggested that involving Cordelia was the wrong option, but he didn't criticise Mr Gummer's handling of the crisis. It's now been 4 months since Andrew's death, and Christine is on her way to see Mr Gummer. She thinks he could have done more.
We're about 2 minutes from John Gummer's office. We've just passed the Houses of Parliament, and it's because the government and the establishment didn't put precautions in place, the appropriate precautions in place, that I'm now actually having to confront Mr Gummer about my son's death. There's a lot of emotions going through here at the moment. I'm shaking like a leaf. I'm really scared that I'm actually going to let Andrew down and become angry, and I don't want to become angry. I want to be measured, and I want to actually put him on the spot. When you said beef was safe, why did you say beef was safe when it clearly wasn't?
Because I believed it was. I was prepared to eat it myself. I was prepared for my family to eat it because I believed it to be safe and because all the evidence showed that it was.
I have spoken to several scientists. There was selective research. They were sat on.
No scientist of any kind was stopped by me from either giving their information or, in many cases, being cross-examined by me. I only wanted to know the facts. Look, how could I possibly have allowed my family and myself to eat something that I thought wasn't safe?
I have actually got recommendations from the Phillips report. It is now clear that this campaign of reassurance was a mistake.
Well, I can only quote Lord Phillips, who specifically said to me in the report, in his statement about the report, that he had no criticism of me.
You were Minister of Math. What about ministerial responsibility?
That's what Lord Phillips was saying about my ministerial responsibility. He had no criticism of me.
How can I accept that when Lord Phillips says the possibility of risk to humans was not communicated to the public?
I do not believe I could or should have done other than I did do, and I also believe that that is exactly the answer which the independent inquiry came to. So it's not only my belief, but it's the belief of the independent inquiry. And it's also my memory, because I remember that at every point and on every occasion I sought to make the best choice, the best decision I could for the safety and health of myself, my family, my country.
This is not a disease without blame. This is not a disease that just happened, but it's the British establishment against me, and I don't know whether I'm able to even make a dent in it, but I'm going to try on Andrew's behalf. He asked me to do this. When he was dying, he said to me, "Mum, this must never happen again. Mum, you must find out who did this to me, and Mum, you must expose them."
That 1 in 1,000 people in Britain could be carrying the infection, but they still don't know how many will go on to develop VCJD.